Fast forward to 1492, when Christopher Columbus first caught sight of the New World.
They were seeking fabled, promised lands of plenty where everything would just, run free and there would be this abundant wealth just waiting for them.
As Europeans mastered the oceans, others sailed in Columbus's wake.
For generations, you have people crossing the Atlantic from Europe who are dreaming of America and the life it might give.
The Spanish were the first to establish a permanent settlement in what we now know as Florida. The French soon followed, but the British were in hot pursuit.
The first English men settled in what they saw as the New World in North America in 1607, some who saw themselves as adventurers. They settled the colony of Jamestown in present-day Virginia. Given that they were men of leisure generally, they didn't have the skills or the knowledge to make a colony survive. In about a decade, 80% had perished. And just at the point when it was looking like Britain's first North American settlement was going to fail, they find that they can grow tobacco. And all of a sudden, that colony begins to boom and grow.
This first British colony opened a gateway to a new life.
The first settlers had this sort of image of themselves as people who were fleeing the old world, and they were building this shining city on a hill that was going to be a beacon to the rest of humanity.
Everybody can live their dream. This is a land full of opportunities.
And that's such a shaping influence on the United States.
The first African slaves came into the Jamestown colony in 1619.
That first ship carried around 20 slaves.
And therein really begins the history of slavery in America.
George Washington was a slave owner. Thomas Jefferson, third president, was a slave owner. The phrase from the Constitution is, all men are created equal. And it's there that we see the first inherent contradiction.
Women are excluded. The indigenous population is excluded. Enslaved Africans are also excluded.
That refusal to recognize the essential humanity of black people runs right the way through American history.
The America we know today, one of the richest, most powerful democracies in the world, was built on the backs of slaves.
If you want to become a world power, you can't go too far wrong by integrating a program of almost limitless free labor.
In the 17th and 18th centuries, African slaves mainly worked on the tobacco plantations in the South. But by the early 19th century, this had given way to cotton plantations, as huge demand for cotton grew in America and Europe.
They're trading by the mid-19th century in the millions of bales every year.
And to actually meet that global demand, there is an increased demand for slave labor. It's an economic system as well. It's actually going to, in many ways, drive the destiny of the country.
The property value of slaves increases too.
Those who are seen as healthy and fit are considered prized possessions.
A slave economy is what enables America to really begin to build the extraordinary wealth that it still benefits from today.
By 1860, America's slave population had reached nearly 4 million, resulting in an incredible explosion of the country's financial power.
The collective wealth held in America's 4 million African American slaves was roughly $3 billion, which was more than the combined value of all the railroads and the factories in the country combined.
Slavery was deeply entrenched in the South. But in the North, it was a different story.
The North becomes increasingly mechanized. You see the emergence of a factory system. You have an increasingly industrialized North. There's less need for as many physical hands.
The North do see a slave-based economy as part of the past. It's not where America is moving.
By 1860, tensions over slavery had reached a fever pitch, and things escalated further when Abraham Lincoln was elected president.
Lincoln was morally opposed to slavery. The white South fear that he will use his power to bring about the emancipation of the slaves and the destruction of their entire way of life. This is the point of no return.
Convinced that the government would do all in its power to abolish slavery and sever the institution that drove their booming economy, 11 southern states broke away from the North.
Together, they form a new country, the Confederate States of America.
It has its own currency, its own government.
And they make a new flag, a Confederate flag. For the United States, these individuals are traitors. They have torn the Union apart.
The Civil War had begun. It would embroil America in a deadly battle, bringing into doubt its very survival.
The question of slavery will now be settled in what became the nation's bloodiest war.
There is no doubt that slavery was the fundamental cause of the war, but the abolition of slavery was not Lincoln's priority. That was preservation of the Union.
The nation, in world historical terms, isn't even a toddler yet, right? And so the idea that it could, in fact, be riven by this ideological debate is what Lincoln and many others are desperate to avoid.
Britain and France were ready to recognize the Southern Confederate States as a separate nation. Lincoln had to act.
In January 1863, he issues the Emancipation Proclamation.
This legislation declared that all slaves in active rebellion against the Union shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free.
He's saying, those individuals who are now free, you can come and join the Union and you can fight for us. This proclamation was a wartime measure. It's a war tactic.
Nearly 200,000 African Americans would answer the call to fight against the South.
Enslaved African Americans will now fight for their own freedom.
The Civil War was the deadliest conflict in American history.
It was brutal. It was horrific.
After 4 years of savage conflict, the Civil War finally ended in 1865. The Union had been saved, and in a landmark moment, the government passed the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery.
The 13th Amendment is the teeth to the Emancipation Proclamation.
The abolition of slavery is monumental.
They were no longer bound by the condition of their mothers to a life of enslavement in perpetuity.
Finally, those famous words that all men are created equal may finally actually be fulfilled.
The 13th Amendment ensured that African Americans would be forever free. But what it didn't answer was this set of thorny questions about what that freedom would actually look like.
We now have 4 million more free individuals in the United States. So what are we going to do? How do we rebuild?
In 1896, America tried to answer that question. But their answer would lead to yet more division, inequality, and bloodshed.
After the Civil War, the United States enters into a period of about 10, 12 years called the period of Reconstruction.
So Reconstruction is a partially successful experiment in securing newfound rights to former slaves. But it comes to an end prematurely because of white Southerners' determination to restore their dominion over the South.
The South lost the war, but the ideology of white supremacy was not dislodged.
And so they fight to make sure that the South remains under the rule of white supremacy.
Okay, we're all equal, but the races do need to remain separate. So the doctrine was known as separate, but equal. They needed that racial hierarchy. They needed that to be written into the law, and they did.
In 1896, a landmark case made racial segregation the law of the land for the whole of the United States.
The Supreme Court say if services are offered equally, it doesn't matter if they're racially segregated. And so you actually see a mushrooming of laws across the North and the South that begins to separate and partition the United States. One world for white individuals, another world for Black individuals. And it covers everything that you can think of. Interracial marriage is banned. You cannot work together. You cannot eat together.
We would have a Black school and a white school, and we'd have one carriage in a railway car and 9 where white people could sit. What I'm getting at here is that it was never equal. And so racial inequality finds new life.
Segregation to the average Negro means being held back. He wants to move forward in the American mainstream. Segregation holds him back.
America was now brutally divided along racial lines.
Racial segregation was humiliating and degrading. You were not one of those individuals who lived in the land of the free.
All of this would have an enormous psychological effect on the African-American population, partly because if you fell foul of particular laws, the consequences would be dire.
Intimidation and violence were used to prevent African Americans going about their everyday lives, and even from exercising their constitutional right to vote.
You could be beaten. Your house could be burned down. You could be lynched.
These are sadistic forms of violence. It's not just the physical oppression, it's the psychological oppression. That the threat of the violence was this long shadow cast over African Americans that conditioned their every move in public.
The most ruthless and notorious organization that rose up during this period was the Ku Klux Klan, who unleashed a reign of terror on the Black communities.
The Ku Klux Klan is a terrorist organization.
The mission of the Klan was the preservation of white people at the top of a racial hierarchy.
I told the mayor here if he refused to negotiate the racial issue with the members of the Klan, then we will start an economic boycott against this city.
The Klan actually reaches its greatest power in the 1920s when it has several million followers. It's so powerful that its members are able to march publicly on the streets of Washington, D.C. in front of the nation's capital.
With white supremacist organizations like the KKK and racial segregation enforced throughout the country, equality seemed impossible.
World War II is yet another turning point in this story of African American freedom.
During the war, 125,000 African American soldiers were sent abroad to fight, and what they encountered while serving sparked a revolution.
The experience of being stationed overseas is a moment of enlightenment for many African American soldiers. Be they stationed in Britain or France or Italy, they experienced greater interaction between the races. They fought a war to liberate Europe, and yet they were returning home to a country that didn't bestow the same kind of rights and privileges to people of color. Many veterans, when they return home, seek to push for racial change and reform.
They initiate the Double V campaign. We will fight fascism abroad, and we will also fight racism at home. Really the precursor to what we'll see in the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s.
An event on the 5th of December, 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, would become the critical moment in this burgeoning movement.
Rosa Parks decided on that day in December that she would not give up her seat on the bus, as was required by racial segregation laws.
She was arrested and taken to jail, and the outcry in the Black community that such a well-known and dignified woman had been jailed sparked the Montgomery bus boycott.
For over a year, African Americans refused to use the buses in Montgomery, and they actually bankrupt the company, forcing them to come to the table to negotiate and to finally end practices of racial segregation on the buses.
Rosa Parks became known as the mother of the civil rights movement, and the Montgomery bus boycott would also place young pastor Martin Luther King at the front and center.
Martin Luther King is the icon of the civil rights movement.
He had a way to connect with the nation, to tell the nation that you are not living up to what you defined yourselves to be.
We will no longer sell our birthright of freedom for the mess of segregated pottage.
The reason that he's so iconic is because of his philosophy of nonviolence. It's an extraordinary radical move to say, we're going to fight this injustice without violence. So that contrast becomes very, very powerful.
Unlike the Civil War just a century earlier, peaceful protest would form the bedrock of the entire movement, which exploded in 1960.
Students bring a vigor and an intensity that hasn't quite been witnessed before.
The student sit-ins are simply an attempt to secure integrated seating at lunch counters across the South.
They begin to occupy spaces where they are told you are not allowed to be. And they say, we're here and we're going to stay.
People would pour drinks over their heads. They were being told to sit quietly, to not retaliate, to do nothing.
They are engaging in acts of non-violent civil disobedience. These students are actually breaking the law.
On February 27, 80 Nashville students were arrested out of over 300.
This is a new radical phase of protest that willing to peacefully defy laws that they can withstand the worst that the white power structure can throw at them. It's that sharper-edged protest that will bring about the civil rights revolution of the 1960s.
By the late summer of 1963, more than 200,000 people marched on Washington.
Ladies and gentlemen, your attention, please.
They gathered by the Lincoln Memorial, the very place where just 4 decades ago, the KKK had been allowed to protest. Their aim? To push through civil rights legislation and establish job equality for all.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation.
It's at that protest in Washington that King, standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, delivers his most famous speech, the I Have a Dream oration.
But that speech is far more than a dream. It's actually a critique of the United States. He's actually addressing the nation on the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. Are African Americans free 100 years later after Abraham Lincoln first said, yes, you are free? Martin Luther King says no. The nation has not lived up to that promise. Martin Luther King really understood the potential of the United States, and he pushed the United States to live up to what the founding fathers sought for the nation.
The following year, the Civil Rights Act was signed into law, ending nearly a century of racial segregation. And the Voting Act, guaranteeing African Americans the right to exercise their vote, was passed 12 months later. It had taken over 3 centuries since the arrival of the first slaves in Jamestown to finally address the deep-seated problems that had blighted America.